Hello and welcome. My name is Alexander Hagberg and I'm a team driver for Team X-Ray. In this series of videos, we'll guide you through a full kit build and some tech tips about the new X-Ray X12'22, which is the new version of the X12 that was just released. This series of videos will be very helpful if you purchase this car. You can learn how to put the car together correctly and also some tech tips along the way for setting up and fine-tuning the setup of the car. So let's start with this build video. Let's open up the box. And see what's inside. The box looks the same as the box from last year in the 21 kit. But obviously the contents are a bit different. Let's see what's inside. We obviously have the manual, stickers, which is standard in X-ray kits, the certificate of authenticity, which we're gonna put aside for now. And we're gonna start with the front suspension, so the front part of the car. But first of all, we have the chassis plate. This is the EU version, aluminum flex chassis, which has cutouts in it, so it means that it's more flexible than the solid chassis that comes in the US kit. So the aluminum flex chassis is recommended for low to medium grip, whereas the solid chassis is mainly for US grip, which means high grip on the CRC black carpet. So for this particular kit, I'm going to use the EU chassis, the aluminum flex. And we're going to install the front suspension first. It's bag number 1. I'm going to use my hoodie parts tray here to separate the parts, to not make too much of a mess. We got the front suspension arm here, front bumper, the front brace, and all these other parts here. We can separate them here. We got these new arm reinforcement plates, which are new. And a lot of other parts. And we're going to separate these other small parts in the parts tray here as well. All these screws and different bits. Okay, throw these away. So we got all the parts lined up here and separated, but before we do anything, we're going to prepare the front suspension arm. So this front suspension arm is made out of carbon, which means that it's sometimes susceptible to delamination or breaking in a hard crash. So we're going to glue this with CA glue to seal it to have better protection in case of a crash. So how am I going to do this? We're going to grab a bottle of CA glue. It can be a thin glue or a more medium thickness glue. It doesn't really matter. But the trick that I use is I use a glue kicker to seal this once it's done, and it helps to use a small nozzle for the glue to help this run around the edges of the arm. So be careful they don't put excessive amounts of glue, but it needs to run around all the edges. So this glue I use here is pretty thick, so it doesn't flow too quickly, so I can control the flow of the glue around the edges. And as I said, this helps to protect the front suspension arm in case of a crash. So now I've done all the top parts of the arm. I'm gonna spray some kicker, glue activator to seal this glue so it doesn't run everywhere when we turn this around. And then we're going to turn this around and repeat this process for this side. And keep adding glue around here. Be careful that the glue doesn't flow onto the surface area of the arm. And then we do the same. We spray the kicker to seal the glue. Got a bit of excess glue here. Just gonna cut this away. Leave this to rest for a bit. Part is done. And we can continue with the build. So we have the front arm here, it's glued. And we're gonna continue with the front kingpins. So the front kingpins, they are available in different degrees. So the EU kit comes with 1.5 degrees kingpins, which gives you good balance between steering and stability. But we also offer these in optional 0.5, 1 degree and 2 degree angles to fine-tune the steering of the car and the feeling of the car. The US kit comes with 1 degree kingpins for the sake of taking away front grip and making the car more consistent for high grip conditions. So for this particular kit, we got the 1.5 degrees 1-dot kingpins, which I'm going to install here. You can see here that the arm is slightly recessed here. So we install these with the dot outwards, the dot pointing away from the arm. And we're gonna use something that's new on the 22 car. It's the arm reinforcement plates, which they fixate here from the outside point where the kingpin mounts towards the inside of the arm. This will reinforce the arm in case of a crash and will make it less likely for you to damage the arm. So we're just gonna add this M3 nut here. And then to the other side. Same thing here, the reinforcement plate goes on top of the kingpin. We add the M3 nut. And eventually we're gonna connect the top stiffener and add screws here, but after that, before that, we're gonna add these little arm inserts which hold the pivot balls. I'm gonna take all the pivot balls out here. These are the stand-ups for the front brace. And these are the pivot balls. Okay, so these little arm inserts, they are held in place by small O-rings. Which we got here. I'm gonna remove a little bit of glue that came into the arm here. It's just an aesthetical touch, doesn't really influence anything. Okay, so these arm inserts, they're pushed into the arm from the bottom. You push them in from the bottom like this, and you install the O-ring from the top. Like that. The same here. Insert from the bottom of the arm, O-ring on top. Just repeat this process for all 4 inserts. And the 4th one here. Okay, that's all done. We're gonna move on to the next step. We're gonna install the pivot balls. So the pivot balls are installed on the bottom of the arm. I'm gonna use the Hoodie multi-tool for this task. I'm gonna put this pivot ball onto the multi-tool like this. I'm gonna install it from the bottom. Push it in place like that. Make sure that it's seated well into the insert. So these don't have to move freely because they're gonna fixate the arm to the chassis anyway. So this is not a moving part of the suspension. So free movement is not necessary in this case. Keep that in mind. I'm gonna keep pushing in these balls in the bottom of the arm. Make sure it's seated well here. Down. The Hoodie multi-tool really makes this job a lot easier, so I really recommend using this tool to not damage your arms and to have a smooth building process. done, we're then going to continue by installing the front brace. So the front brace can be installed directly onto the arm like this, without standoffs, without any shims or anything. This makes the front suspension arm the stiffest, so that's the stiffest flex setting. You also have the standard option, which is to use these little standoffs, which we're going to utilize for the standard kit setting, which is a medium setting. And then you have the option to remove this stiffener completely. So basically, the more grip that the track has, the stiffer setting I can recommend. So you can play with the setting to see what it does. I usually use the medium setting for most conditions. So the standoffs under the front brace. So we're gonna install these standoffs here from the bottom. .6mm screws that go through the bottom of the arm. Put this in place, and once you put these screws in here, you can then tighten the kingpin nuts down. And we'll repeat it for the other side. Put the standoff here. So to run without this brace, I would only recommend basically for asphalt racing or very low grip carpet. For most tracks, I recommend running the brace either with standoffs or directly onto the chassis. So this is gonna be mounted now with these 5mm round head screws from the top. Like that. Front brace is installed. Make sure that these screws are nice and tight. Tighten the nuts for the kingpins. It's done. We're then going to install the steering blocks. Okay, so the steering blocks, they need these wheel axles installed first. And push these in place here. They mount with M3 nuts from the back. Another one here. Those are done. We can then install the ball studs, which will connect the steering link to the steering block. So the initial setting here is 3mm of shims. But this highly depends on the type of servo used. In this case, I'm going to install 3mm of bump steer shims under the ball stud. But we're going to go into the setting in relation to the servo type used later on. But for now, we're going to use 3mm in the inside hole of the steering block, so the initial setting for the Ackerman. These ball studs are quite long, so you can use up to 4mm of bump steer shims, if not more, if you desire to do so. So that's a good update as well, that you're really able to fine-tune the bump steer in this kit. Make sure that you thread this in straight. And we're then gonna install 2 millimeters of shims here on the kingpins, which they determine the height of the steering blocks. We mostly run 2 millimeters underneath. You can change axle height with these shims, but the only thing that you really change with the axle height on this car is the bump steer, because this car has no upper arm, so the roll center cannot be adjusted in the front. So when we've installed the steering blocks here with 2 millimeters of shims underneath the blocks, we're gonna install a very thin shim on top of the steering block, which determines the droop of the front suspension. I'm gonna use the initial setting, which is 2 of these shims on top. Let's check the size of these. These are very thin, so you can fine-tune the droop setting of the front suspension. There's a 0.2 millimeter shim here. And this is a 0.1. We're just gonna put 0.2 millimeters on each side as a basic setting. Then the front springs go onto here. And a 5 millimeter round head screw is holding the spring in place here. Okay, that's in place. We then have another new thing on the X12'22 is the steering lock limiters. They look like this. When I install these onto the arms, and what do these do? The steering lock limiters, they are a physical limit for the steering, so that you can set the steering lock limitation in fine steps using a screw, which I'm going to show you. And by having a physical limitation of the steering lock, you'll have less wheel chatter when you are at full lock. So this can help to improve the consistency of the car and to improve corner speed. So I'm going to put this in place here like this. One goes on that side, and the other one goes on this side. So we found that this really improves the consistency of the handling, and you're able to set different steering lock limitations for different conditions. In general, I recommend more steering lock, so a bigger steering angle for lower grip tracks, and a higher steering angle a lower steering angle, less degrees for higher grip, and a higher steering angle, more steering lock for lower grip. And how do we set this? We're going to install small screws here into these holes here, which I'm going to show you now. We're going to use 4mm round head screws that we thread in here. If you thread this all the way in, you'll have 27 degrees of maximum steering lock, which is suggested for most conditions, including European carpet. For racing on black carpet in the US, we recommend reducing the steering lock. So you then need to thread this screw out a bit to limit the steering lock. And if you remove the screw altogether, you can achieve a maximum steering lock of 30 degrees or more. So if you desire more steering lock than 27 degrees, you have to remove the screw completely. And you can refer to the manual, as for the distance here, how to achieve 24 degrees of maximum steering lock. So you have those three options to fine-tune with these new features. And that front suspension is built. Before we put this on the chassis, we're gonna install the front bumper, which looks like this. It mounts with these countersunk screws and M3 nuts into the front part of the chassis. Just put this on here. And we're later gonna install the front foam bumper onto this bumper. If you want, you can glue this bumper to reinforce it to make it stronger as well, in the same way that I did to the front suspension arm. It's not necessary, but it's a nice thing to do if you want to improve the durability of the front bumper. This one's on here. The bumper is installed, and we can now install the front suspension onto the chassis. So we got all these ride-height shims here. These shims, they allow you to finely adjust the ride height of the car. They come in 0.2, 0.4 and 0.6 millimeters, so you can fine-tune the ride height in steps of 0.2 millimeters. In this case, we're just going to install all the three of them to both sides. You can obviously purchase additional shims for more fine-tuning. And these long countersunk screws are used for mounting the front suspension arms. The shorter screws goes for the rear part. The longer screws goes for the front part. And why? Because we're gonna have to install a shim which adjusts the caster setting of the car, which I'm gonna talk about in the caster tech tip video. And obviously you have the option here to adjust the wheelbase of the car. So you have two holes here for the mounting of the front suspension arm. So front one and the rearward one. So you can adjust the front wheelbase in steps of 2 millimeters. So the short wheelbase is the rearward hole, and the long wheelbase is the forward hole. So I'm going to use the initial kit setting, which is the forward hole, which is a long wheelbase, which is recommended for especially low to medium grip conditions and asphalt racing. And if you race on higher grip, especially in spec classes where you desire a lot of steering, I recommend the short front wheelbase. But it's nice to have the option to quickly change in between a long and a short car. then we're gonna slide in the ride height shims here. They slide in from the side like this. Let's put them all together like this and put them in place. Now we can tighten screws for the front suspension arm. And we'll repeat this process for the other side. And they slide in here under the caster shim. Make sure the caster shim is on top of the ride height shims. And that's it. That concludes the building of the front suspension.